Normandy Invasion, also called Operation Overlord or D-Day, during World War II, the Allied invasion of Western Europe, which was launched on June 6, 1944. The most celebrated D-Day of the war, with the simultaneous landing of US, British, and Canadian forces on 5 separate beachheads in Normandy, France. By the end of August 1944, all of northern France was liberated, and the invading forces reorganized for the drive into Germany, where they would eventually meet with Soviet forces advancing from the east to bring an end to the Nazi Reich. Planning, 1941–43. A year prior to the Allied invasion of Normandy in midsummer 1944, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht had occupied all the territory gained during the blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939–41 and most of its Russian conquests in 1941–42. The Wehrmacht also maintained control over the North African coast, which it had acquired while aiding Italy in 1941. The Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk had pushed back the perimeter of Hitler's Europe in the east, but he and his allies still held all of mainland Europe, with the exception of Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, and Sweden. Although America's growing economic power overshadowed that of Nazi Germany, its war economy still surpassed that of both Britain and the Soviet Union, except for in tank and aircraft production. Hitler could prolong his military dominance for years to come unless the Western Allies intervened directly on the continent with a substantial American army commitment. The Second Front. Starting in 1942, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin urged his allies, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to launch a second front in the West. Although it was not possible at the time due to various circumstances, Britain had already begun planning for a return to the continental mainland after the retreat from Dunkirk in 1940. And the Americans began developing their own timetable after Hitler declared war on the U.S. in December 1941. Unlike the British, the Americans pushed for an early invasion, even in 1942 if possible. George C. Marshall appointed Dwight D. Eisenhower to create an operational plan for Allied victory. Operations Roundup and Sledgehammer. In 1942, Eisenhower developed 2 plans for a second front in the West to be launched in 1943 or 1942, known as Operation Roundup and Operation Sledgehammer. Operation Roundup was adopted by the British, but their objective doubts led to the postponement of the invasion through 1942 and 1943, which caused concern at inter-Allied conferences. Roosevelt and Stalin eventually combined against Churchill to set May 1944 as the unalterable date for the invasion. Stalin agreed to launch an offensive in Eastern Europe and join the war against Japan after Germany was defeated. Operation Overlord. The decision made at Tehran indicated America's determination to conduct the cross-channel invasion despite Alan Brooke's opposition. The British, however, had been secretly planning for Operation Overlord, coordinated by Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, who was appointed COSSAC in January 1943. The plan was for a landing in Normandy, with 3 divisions and 2 brigades to be airdropped, followed by another 11 divisions in the first 2 weeks using 2 artificial harbors. Once a foothold was secured, a force of 100 divisions would be assembled in France for a final assault on Germany. In January 1944, Eisenhower became the Supreme Allied Commander, and COSSAC was renamed SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Fortress Europe. Hitler was aware of the potential for a cross-channel invasion by the Anglo-American Allies but downplayed the threat as long as they focused on other fronts. By November 1943, he accepted the imminent danger and appointed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to oversee defensive preparations along the Channel coast. Rommel was first appointed as the Inspector of Coastal Defenses and then as the commander of Army Group B, which officially reported to Commander-in-Chief West Gerd von Rundstedt but had many operational decisions controlled by Hitler.